All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Crispin Little, who's here to give us a special seminar. Chris is at the University of Leeds, and he started there in 2000, I think. Yeah, 2000, after a postdoc at at UCLA and after a postdoc at the Natural History Museum of London. So Chris is one of the experts on the early Jurassic biota. So we've been collaborating with him. He's helping us figure out what all our little bivalves and brachiopods are. And he's going to talk to us today about the biotic response to environmental perturbations in Pliensbachian and Toarcian stages of the Lower Jurassic.
Thanks very much, Rowan. So I'll get straight onto the first slide. So the first slides in the talk are going to be introductory to set the scene, because I'm not sure that everyone is cognizant necessarily with Jurassic stratigraphy. But anyway, the time period that we're going to be talking about today is here. So it's in the Lower Jurassic, the last two stages of the Lower Jurassic, the Pliensbachian and the Toarcian. And as for pretty much all of the Jurassic, the time periods within it are separated using ammonite biozones. And this biozonation is about as good as you can get in terms of defining different time periods within it. So ammonite biozones in the Jurassic is something in the order of 1 million years in length. And the ones that we're going to be dealing with today, so the ones in the upper part of the Pliensbachian are the Margaritatus and Spinatum zones. And then in the Toarcian, I'll be talking about the Tenuocostatum zone, the Serpentinum or Falciferan zone, and the Bifron zone. And then I'll also be talking in some of the sections on the upper part of the Toarcian. So these words here I will be referring to a lot in the talk. In terms of time periods here, so it shows the dates. So something in the order of 184 million years going all the way up to 177 million years in the geological past. So a bit of historical background to this topic. So in the early 1980s, there was a lot of work done by several eminent paleontologists to look at extinctions and recoveries in the geological record. And some of the most well-known work has been done by Dave Raup and Jack Sepkoski. And this here is their family level chart of extinctions from the Triassic time period through to the present day. And one of the peaks in the extinctions here is here, and that equates to the Pliensbachian-Toarcian time period. This here is a paper which was published a little bit later on by Tony Hallam, who was another mollusk expert, unfortunately now dead. And he did, this is European bivalve species level analysis. And as you can see here on the chart, there was a big drop in his analyses from the Pliensbachian, the top of the Pliensbachian into the early Toarcian, and diversity in bivalves remained low and then picked up in the late Toarcian time period. Now, it's important to point out here that the level of analyses in both of these charts is at the stage level. The biozone level. And what this means is that it's not possible in these charts to work out whether an extinction recovery is actually at the stage boundary, the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary, or as it turns out, as you'll see in the later slides, actually quite a lot of the biotic problems or biotic perturbations actually occur within the Tenuocostatum zone of the Toarcian. So after these analyses on higher level taxa, geochemists started to get particularly interested in this period of time in the late part of the Jurassic. And the geochemical analyses included looking at total organic carbon and also carbon isotopes as well, both carbon isotopes in organic material and carbon isotopes in carbonates. And this shows here the section that I'm going to talk about a little bit yet later on in Yorkshire in the UK. And what you can see here is that total organic carbon levels in the early part of the Toarcian, in the serpentinum zone, are really peak. So they go from just a few weight percent up to almost 10 weight percent TOC. And this is coincident with laminated black shales, which I'll show you pictures of a little bit later on. And associated with that, in the organic carbon, there is a really significant negative isotope shift. And this is something that you see actually in many sections. So this graph here shows sections across the world. So here we have France, here we have Slovenia into Greece, Peniche in Portugal. And in all of these sections, you actually see this negative carbon isotope shift. It's one of the largest actually in the whole of the Phanerozoic, and therefore implies some really quite considerable perturbations to the global carbon cycle at this particular period of time. Now, another thing to point out on these graphs here is that quite a lot of the southern hemisphere, not the southern European sections, like Peniche here, have very low total organic carbon, so virtually none. And that's important when we look at this chart here, which is a very useful collection of all of the total organic carbon values that have been published for the early Toarcian time period. So each of these either squares or circles is somewhere where we have data on the carbon isotope excursion. That's what CIE means here. And you can see that the size of these dots here is scaled to the actual perturbation away from the pre-excursion value. And another thing to point out here is that this organic carbon can be from several sources. It's either terrestrially derived in the squares here, or it's derived from marine organic material, or a mixture of the two. And that's quite important as well, because actually different carbon sources, terrestrial sources and marine sources, can actually have slightly different carbon isotope signatures. So some of the things that I'll be saying in this talk actually can relate to different sources of organic carbon being captured in these sections. But the point here is that in the early Toarcian time period, in the serpentinum zone, the falciferum zone, which is what you're looking at here, is that many sections have this carbon isotope excursion. In fact, it is pretty much global. So we find data over here from Canada, so that's stuff that Rowan has published. There is data here from South America. We see a similar sort of carbon isotope excursion. There is material over here, there's data over here from Japan, which was in the Panthalasic Ocean. All of these sections show this negative carbon isotope signature, and it's even being found now in paleo lake deposits in China. So this is a truly global phenomenon, and it's one which is not just seen in marine settings, but also in terrestrial settings as well. So what is less global in terms of its extent is the amount of total organic carbon which is present in these early Toarcian rocks. So this is another very useful global compilation here. And what you're looking at here is the amount of total organic carbon in sections where it's been measured. In this case, before the carbon isotope excursion in the falciferum zone of the early Toarcian. This is during the falciferum zone itself. So you'll see here that the total organic carbon contents, particularly in Northwest Europe, so we're talking about the UK here, we're talking about northern and southern Germany and into France, TOC values in the rocks there get really high, so up to 10 weight percent. After the carbon excursion here, you'll see that values really drop away in most places, but still in some places in Northwest Europe, there are still quite high TOC values. Right. Another thing which has been found in recent years, or noticed, is that there is a large igneous province down in the southern hemisphere, which has been dated to pretty close to the events that I've been talking about. So in the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary and into the early Toarcian. And these include these big lava flows from the Karoo Basin in South Africa, and then a whole series of igneous intrusions in Antarctica as well. So, and also there are some intrusions as well in the southern part of this province as well. So this is now called the Karoo-Ferrar Large Igneous Province, and you'll see that there's really good uranium-led geochronology on zircons from this. So we're pretty confident now that this event, this large igneous province, is coincident with those environmental perturbations, the carbon isotope excursion, the large total organic carbon content in some sections. And therefore, it's pretty logical to try and tie these things together, which what a lot of people have done. So this is one of several published models about how this large igneous province could have caused environmental perturbations, this global carbon isotope excursion during this period of time in the late Jurassic. So in this model here, the isotopically light carbon dioxide is coming out of volcanoes, but also there could be some light carbon which is being released through igneous intrusions into coal deposits at the time. So this light carbon here, this CO2, being pumped into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years during the large igneous province, and that would have caused global warming, and that would have caused a whole series of cascading events. So in shallow water areas, particularly in the epicontinental seaways, like in Northwest Europe, this would have caused increased precipitation, increased runoff into the basins, would have caused primary productivity to increase, and therefore during that primary productivity and the decay, oxidation of organic material would have caused some of these epicontinental seaways to lose oxygen. And also with a reduced salinity layer on top due to this runoff. In the open ocean conditions here, then there is a potential for acidification because of the CO2, increased CO2 in the atmosphere, increased OMZs. So I forgot what OMZ stand for again. Thank you very much. Oxygen minimum zone. So for those to increase, and therefore for organic rich material to be deposited on the sea floor at the time. And of course, because this is impacting the atmosphere, then light carbon is being taken up by terrestrial plants as well, which then that explains why you see this global carbon isotope excursion signal both in the terrestrial and marine realm at the same time. Now, it has to be said that you have to pump quite a lot of through volcanic activity. You have to pump a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere to get the sort of negative excursion that you see. So in some of the earlier papers that were trying to explain this negative carbon isotope signature, the model was actually for the warming at this period of time, or the warming we think happened, to disassociate methane hydrates in the sea, because methane is much more negative than this sort of volcanic CO2. So actually it may be a combination of these sorts of CO2 sources into the atmosphere at the time during the late Jurassic that causes these sorts of environmental perturbations. But anyway, these sorts of models have predictions as to what we might see in the biological record during this time period. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And I'm going to go to the heart of the beast in terms of the effects of these perturbations, and that is to an area which is close to where I live, and that is the Cleveland Basin, which is a series of outcrops in a series of beautiful coastal cliff exposures in North Yorkshire. Now, in terms of where that was during the early Jurassic time period. This is a paleogeographic map. You may have seen some of these before from the Mesozoic time period, but during this period of time in the Jurassic, there was this large wedge-shaped ocean, the Tethys Ocean, and then the continents here were squashed together into these land masses, Laurasia in the north, Gondwana in the south, and then the Panthalastic Ocean was basically the other half of the world. So not in Europe here, you'll see that it was actually pretty complex in terms of paleogeography at this period of time. So an awful lot of these small islands in the northwest portion of the Tethys Ocean. And then there was a connection between the Boreal Ocean and this part of northwest Europe through the Viking corridor, which would eventually turn into the Northern Atlantic later on. And then also there may have been a connection to the Panthalastic Ocean through a seaway called the Hispanic Corridor, which is not particularly well proved in terms of paleogeography, but there is biotic reasons to suggest there was a link through that corridor. So the point here is that these small islands in the northwest Tethys were often not linked to the open ocean, particularly to the Tethys at the south, and that allowed them to have, but certainly become more stratified and less connected to the open oceans in the early part of the Jurassic time period. So anyway, so I'm going to talk now about the Cleveland Basin in more detail. So this is the stratigraphy. So here we have the Pliensbachian, this is the Toarcian, and the stratigraphy here starts off with a Stayed Sandstone, Cleveland Ironstone formation of the late Pliensbachian. Majority of the Toarcian is the Whitby Mudstone formation, and then it goes up to a sandstone at the top of the Toarcian called the Pliensbachian Sandstone. And here we have this is the biostratigraphy here. So those biozones I was talking about earlier on. So Margaritatus spinatum in the Pliensbachian, Tenuocostatum, Serpentinium, Bifrons, and up in the Toarcian. So this is a stratigraphic log from the late part of the Toarcian going up, late part of the Pliensbachian going up into the Toarcian. And basically you can consider this as being like a big regressive, transgressive, and regressive cycle. So it starts off here with sandstones, and then it goes in the Cleveland Mudstone. The Whitby Mudstone formation is, as it sounds, it's mostly mudstones. And then it starts to coarsen upwards into the sandstones at the very top of the Toarcian time period. So in terms of what these sediments actually look like, so these are rocks of the Stayed Sandstone formation. These are shallow marine deposits, so sands within storm wave base. There's beautiful hummocky cross stratification, for example, in these deposits. The next formation above that is the Cleveland Ironstone formation, which is in the latest part of the Pliensbachian. This is a really interesting sequence of rocks because we actually see cyclic sedimentation here, where you have oolitic ironstones overlain by mudstones, which then pass up into siltstones, fine sandstones, and then into an oolitic ironstone again. So there's a whole series of these cycles. What drives this cyclicity has long been speculated, but actually there are some really interesting oxygen isotope data from brachiopods and oysters from this sequence of rocks that suggest the whole sequence here is actually quite cold. So there is a possibility actually that these are glacio-eustatic cycles. There's a bit of additional evidence actually, because in the late Pliensbachian in northern Germany and also in Siberia, we find glendonites, the only glendonites really from the whole of the Lower Jurassic. And those are often taken to be cold water indicators. So there is some evidence that actually the late Pliensbachian time period was a cold period in the Mesozoic. And most people think of the Mesozoic as being hot, hot, hot all the time. but actually there's started to become more evidence that some periods of time are actually quite cold. Whether they developed ice caps, that's much more speculative. There isn't any evidence for that, but certainly if you look at isotope signatures, then it does appear to be a colder period of time. So this nice cliff here shows the top of the Cleveland Ironstone Formation, then going up into the grey shales, which is the lowest unit of the Whitby Mudstone Formation. And this is a transgressive event. So you go from these cyclic sediments up into finer mudstones and siltstones. And these are biatubated, which is why you can't see any obvious bedding in them. There are a few horizons here of siderite nodules, but otherwise this is a very biatubated unit. So that's the first unit within the Whitby Mudstone Formation. It's the lowest zone, ammonite biozone, tenuocostatum zone. And then this passes up into the Mulgrave Shale member of the Whitby Mudstone Formation. And it's really obvious in the cliff here that this is a different sort of unit, a different sort of sediment, because this is now laminated and we have lost the biotubation. And this is coincident with something that I'll talk about in a minute, which is a really important extinction event. This is also overall transgressive throughout the whole of the lower part of the Whitby Mudstone Formation in the Cleveland Basin. So the Mulgrave Shale in the Whitby Mudstone Formation is and has been a real playground for geochemists. So there's all sorts of interesting things that we see in different sorts of proxies and different sorts of isotopes within this period of time. So here it shows this really the negative carbon isotope signature within the organic material. So you see that very, very large shift in the organic carbon. One thing to point out here as well is that there's a smaller negative carbon isotope shift as well, actually at the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary. And that's something that I'll come back to a little bit later on. So in terms of oxygen isotopes from belemnites, which are nectonic cephalopods, we see cooling from the late Pliensbachian time and into the tenuocostatum zone, and then a very rapid warming here during the falciferum zone, the time period of the carbon isotope excursion. We also see in strontium isotopes a change in the isotopic signature that suggests increased weathering in the basin, and also within osmium isotopes as well. So there seems to be a weathering pulse as shown by the osmium isotope signatures. And there you see that the increase within this period of time of the total organic carbon content as well. So lots of interesting stuff going on in terms of geochemistry reflective of environmental perturbations within the Cleveland Basin. Just as a slight aside, this is a very popular sequence of rocks to go fossil hunting in because you have beautiful preservation of these things. So these beautiful pyritized ammonites. And here's a really big one. So you remember this one, Rowan? So that's a very large Philoceras ammonite. You'll see the scale there. So the point here is that fairly good times for animals which are living in the water column, which is quite intriguing. Okay, so the Whitby Mudstone Formation, this Mulgrave Shale, which is laminated organic rich, it passes upwards into a unit called the alum shale, where you lose the high total organic carbon content, and you have mudstones here that start to get biatubated. Within the basin, in most places, that's where the section ends because there is a middle Jurassic unconformity, which you can see here are in the coastal cliffs around the town of Whitby. And so the top part of the Toarcian is missing in most of the coastal outcrops, apart from one place, which is in a half-graben structure, where we actually have preservation of all of the rest of the Toarcian. So this shows the top part of the Toarcian here. So these are the grey sandstones and yellow sandstones showing this regression at the top of the Toarcian going back into nearshore sandy marine sediments. Right, that was the stratigraphy. So I cut my teeth in terms of research on looking at the fossils within this sequence of time in many places around Europe, but particularly in the Cleveland Basin. And over the years, I've had research students and collaborators who have continued this work. And this is a paper that we published a couple of years back, which is a compilation of lots and lots of data, of thousands and thousands and thousands of data points of occurrences of, in this case, benthic invertebrate fossils throughout this time period. So we're looking here in the late Pliensbachian, Margaritatus and spinatum zone, and then this is all of the Toarcian in the Cleveland Basin. So these are species ranges. So for those of you who are not familiar with species ranges, this marks the first occurrence of that species in the section, and then the end of the range is the last occurrence of the species within the basin. This does not mean this is the actual extinction of this species, which is an important point, which I'll come back to shortly. So it's just the disappearance of the species, that species within the section within the basin. So you can see here that we have different groups of benthic organisms. So all these ones here are bivalves. So pretty species rich in terms of bivalves throughout this succession. Here we've got brachiopods, not so species rich. So not that many brachiopods within the Pliensbachian-Toarcian in the Cleveland Basin. Gastropods, relatively few in the early part of the section, and a lot of species right at the very end. And then there are smaller numbers of species belonging to other benthic inverts like echinoderms here, serpulids, scaphopods, crustaceans, bryozoans. So the majority of the record in terms of diversity here is amongst the bivalves and to a lesser extent, the brachiopods and the gastropods. So I think it's pretty obvious here that there is something nasty happens in the Cleveland Basin at this horizon here. And this horizon is at the very top of the Tenua costatum zone of the Whitby Mudstone Formation, and it's exactly the level that you start to see the first lamination and the first increase in the total organic carbon in the basin. Actually, that's almost an arse about face way of saying this. It's the disappearance of the burrowing animals at this period of time that allows the lamination to remain in the sedimentary sequence. And what this shows is that it's pretty obvious that what's happening in the basin is a decrease in oxygen. So this is, we actually had, it's not just the laminated black shales, but there are other proxies as well for a decrease in oxygen in the basin at the time. And this decrease really had an effect on the bivalves and particularly the infaunal ones. So for one ammonite zone here during the serpentinum zone, when the T-OAE values were very high and when we have that carbon isotope excursion, is that diversity within the basin in benthic fauna is low, but it's not absent. So this here shows a picture of a whole series of epifaunal bivalves living on the sediment surface during the serpentinum zone, the so-called OAE. One thing that I should have said earlier on is this OAE concept, Oceanic Anoxic Event concept. The reason that I put it in inverted commas here is because it's a term I don't like very much for this period of time, because we have almost no record of the oceans because all Jurassic crust has been subducted. And also, as I'll say now and a little bit later on, in many places around the world, there isn't good evidence for anoxia at all. So we have in the community who do research in this period of time, we have debated about alternative terms to use. So we could use, because it's a global phenomenon, carbon isotope excursion. That would be one way of talking about this period of time. Other people have suggested that we should call it the Jenkins event after Hugh Jenkins, who was one of the pioneers here and identifying the geochemical perturbations. But we're still kind of arguing about this. And We're not resolved it yet. Anyway, the point is here is that you have low diversity faunas still living in this period of time that the geochemist will tell you was completely anoxic. This just wasn't the case. But it was very likely we're looking at rather dynamic conditions during this period of time, whereby for maybe decades, maybe hundreds of years, oxygen conditions were very, very low and certainly did not allow infaunal animals to live within the sediment, and probably stopped animals living on the sediment surface. But then there would have been periods of time where there was enough oxygen, at least for animals to inhabit the sediment surface. But these animals were very opportunistic, we think, because this sort of very low diversity but high abundance occurrence of bivalves and other fossils is often taken to be like an opportunistic lifestyle. So this particular organism here, this bivalve called Pseudomytoloides dubius, is one that we see very abundantly within the period of time of high TOC and the carbon isotope excursion. This is another one here. It's a little bivalve with very strong concentric ornamentation called Bositra bucci in this case, and this is a nicely pyritized example. And then we also have another species here of epifaunal bivalve. So very low diversity, but often high abundance faunas during this period of time. So we have called this period of time the survival interval, although that's not really the best term because that implies that animals are surviving from this extinction, where that's not really the case. Actually, we're getting a change into a different sort of opportunistic style of ecosystem. But it's a term that has been used for this sort of phenomenon elsewhere in the geological record. So that continues. This low diversity fauna of pretty much only bivalves as benthos until we start to lose the lamination into the bifron zone of the alum shale member. And from there onwards, we start to see animals which are now burrowing into the sediment. So we see a variety of brachiopods. So Lingula here is an infaunal brachiopod. This thing here, Dacromea, is a shallow burrowing deposit feeding bivalve. And this thing here is a bivalve, a deep burrowing bivalve that would have been a suspension feeder. And by the action of these animals now moving into the sediment, they start to biotubate the sediment, and we lose all of the lovely lamination from earlier time periods. And this is taken to be indicative of now oxygen levels increasing within the basin, such that you're starting to see a re-establishment of more complex communities. So this is a period of time, I'll just go back here, that we have called recovery phase 1. But what does recovery mean in terms of extinction studies? And there's actually a variety of different ways that you can consider ecological recovery. One way to consider it is, when does the species diversity increase again to the level that you saw before the extinction event? So that would be one measure of recovery. Other measures are thinking about the ecological diversity of the organisms that you see after the extinction event. So that can be tiering, and tiering in this case relates to the height above the sediment water interface that the animals are living. So here we see, for example, some crinoids. Those are animals which have high tiering, so they're quite far off the sediment surface. And then these epifaunal bivalves would be low tiering organisms. And then there's a whole variety of other ecological diversity matrices that you can look at. So applying that to our section in the Cleveland Basin, that's what this chart here shows. It's a pretty busy chart, but the take-home message here is that this is prior to the extinction event in the Pliensbachian, the late Pliensbachian into the early Toarcian. And you'll see that the ecological diversity was high. So animals are doing all sorts of different things in the sediment and on the sediment surface, and then into the water column. Then when the extinction level hits, you'll see that the ecological diversity really collapses. You've pretty much only got animals which are living, a few bivalves which are living on the sediment surface as filter feeders. Then in the later recovery phase, or the early recovery phase, you'll see things start to pick up, but it's really only by the very end of the Toarcian you start to see ecological diversity, which is reflective of the diversity that we saw prior to the extinction event in the basin. And the significance of this is that although we get some ecological tiering being partially restored about 2 million years after the extinction, this full ecospace recovery up here at the top of the Toarcian is something in the order of 6 million years after the extinction event. That's a very long period of time. And it does suggest that the Cleveland Basin was subjected to some pretty unpleasant environmental perturbations that took a long time to ameliorate. And that is very different to what we see elsewhere, as you'll see in some upcoming slides. And also, actually, when you consider that length of time compared to some of the really big extinction events, for example, the Permo-Triassic, that's as long as we see in some of the worst places during the recovery from the Permo-Triassic extinction event. All right, so that was all about animals that were benthic. What about animals that were living in the water column, nectic organisms? So this is from an earlier piece of work of mine where I looked at the species ranges of ammonites, going from, this is the late Pliensbachian, that is the Tenuocostatum zone here. And these are belemnites. So obviously these are cephalopods living in the water column. And amongst the ammonites here, you'll see that diversity in the ammonites actually increased quite a lot during the period of time that we had high TOC and the carbon isotope excursion. That's also true for belemnites as well. Belemnites were hit during the extinction event, so we lost some very important genera, a couple of very important genera of belemnites. But then there was an immigration of Tethyan belemnites into the basin, and then these diversified a lot. And the take-home message from this is that while the sediment water interface and the sediment itself was probably impacted by reduced oxygen conditions, that was not the case for nectic organisms. And in the basin as well, we have beautiful preservation of things like ichthyosaurs, marine crocodiles. If the entire water column was anoxic, they couldn't have lived. So this is really good evidence why I think the Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic Event is a horrible term for describing the events during this period of time. Okay, so that was the Cleveland Basin. The Cleveland Basin has some of the best, at least up till now, biotic records of both macrofossils, to some extent microfossils, and also geochemical data as well. But it's improving a lot elsewhere. So obviously there are a lot of sections that I could talk about here, but I'm not going to have time to do so. So I'm going to cherry pick a few areas where there is increasingly good biological and geochemical data that contrast rather nicely with what I just talked about in the Cleveland Basin. Remember, in the Cleveland Basin, we think that what's causing the biotic extinctions is redox. It's about oxygen. Is that true elsewhere? So what I'm going to talk about now is before I do that, I should just say that if you look at ammonites globally, so this is a compilation that was done by Carruthers in 2013, and what he found was that if you look at global ammonite biodiversity, then the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary is one of the most severe crises during this period of time. But there are others as well. So there was a drop in diversity in the early Pliensbachian, there was one in the middle Toarcian, one in the late Toarcian as well. But ammonites do that. Everyone knows ammonites, the very rapid turnover. This is just a feature of the ammonites, but also why they're so good for biostratigraphy. So I don't think you can take too much from what the ammonites are doing. So what I'm going to do now is to move south, both in terms of today's geography, but also in paleogeographically as well. So what I was talking about just now was the Cleveland Basin, which is here. And now I'm going to talk about the Spanish sections, which during the late Jurassic were located here. So just on the northern edge of the Tethys Ocean. And in recent years, people have done lots of good work looking at fossil ranges and associated geochemistry from a whole variety of Spanish sections, a lot from the Iberian range, which is just around Zaragoza. So this is one of the published papers by a colleague of mine and a colleague of some people here called Sylvia Denisi. And these are species ranges. These are brachiopods. These are bivalves here from a section. And I should say that pretty much all of these Spanish sections, the lithologies here are limestones and marls. And that's kind of typical of Tethyan, Toarcian and Pliensbachian rocks. So in terms of stratigraphy, this is the late Pliensbachian. This is the early part of the Toarcian time period. So that's the boundary there. And in this paper here, they identified the Toarcian Oceanic Anoxic Event, but on the basis of having a few weight % increase in the total organic carbon, but otherwise there's almost none in these carbonate sections. And then a small negative isotope shift in the bulk carbonate. But what you can see in these ranges here, if you look at the bivalve ranges, is that there isn't any obvious extinction or associated recovery here. So the bivalves appear to pass through from the late Pliensbachian into the Toarcian without any major perturbation. Yeah, there's a change in species here, but that's what you'd expect in any section that's not being affected by any huge environmental perturbation. So that's the bivalves. In contrast, the brachiopods actually do undergo a big change. So Pliensbachian brachiopods go through into the tenuocostatum zone of the early Toarcian, and then there is a complete turnover. So the later Toarcian brachiopods are completely different to ones earlier in the basin. So that's a feature actually of a lot of Tethyan sections. Not only are they very brachiopod rich, but also it's the brachiopods that really show a big turnover at this period of time. This is from another section in the Iberian range. So again, you're looking at, actually this is the tenuocostatum zone. So this is all Toarcian here. And you'll see again, the Oceanic Anoxic Event, so-called, is identified here by a negative isotope shift in the bulk carbonate. But if you have a look at the bivalves here again, there is no real obvious extinction in this section in the Iberian basin. But the brachiopods do the same thing. So there is a big turnover of brachiopods. So this study is particularly interesting because they actually looked at the oxygen isotope signatures in brachiopods associated with this period of time. And this is this chart here, and this is the graph which is particularly useful to look at. So this is tenuocostatum zone, that's the serpentinum zone, and you'll see that there is a big shift in the oxygen isotope values of brachiopod shells, and that equates to about a 3-degree warming in the basin. So on the basis of this, most people that work in these sections are quite happy that what's happening here is that you're getting quite substantial warming, and that's actually what is causing the biotic changes that you see, particularly in the brachiopods. There is no evidence for anoxia or redox changes in these sections in the Tethys Ocean. So, looks like different sorts of kill mechanism, or at least mechanism or environmental perturbation, which is causing different changes in the faunas in the Spanish sections. Okay, so now I want to mention Morocco, because this is work that's being done by people here in the room. And Morocco, the Moroccan sections down here, so they are now in the corner of the Tethys Ocean. And you can see quite a bit further south in terms of paleogeography. Morocco is fascinating because it's one of the few places that you have really good coral reefs throughout this period of time. And of course, that's significant because if you're thinking about why anyone should be bothered about this period of time, this warming period of time in the Jurassic, then one of the things is that we can use this potentially for looking at future warming effects on this planet. And I'm sure everyone knows here that some of the most critically affected ecosystems today through global warming are the corals. So by looking at these fossil coral reefs here, we may get some idea about what's going to happen in the future to our modern coral reefs. Okay, so Morocco has a very good occurrence of reefs, including the sclerectinian corals. And the data from Morocco, but actually other places where we find corals in the Tethyan region during the Pliensbachian and Toarcian, it was the compilation was published by Vasseur et al. I think Rowan, you're on this paper, aren't you? Yeah. Stefan, you're on it as well. Okay, so you know it well. So what comes out from this paper here is that this is ranges, global ranges of genera of sclerectinian corals, is that the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary is one of the greatest crises within sclerectinian corals that's ever been seen. Very, very significant indeed. And from that paper, I gleaned these values here. It's the extinction of 49% of genera during this period of time, and a lot of species, almost all of the species, became extinct at the boundary here. So there was also another extinction within the corals as well in the early part of the Toarcian, which appears to be associated with the so-called Oceanic Anoxic Event, or CIE anyway. So it appears to be a double hit on the corals at the time. And Travis Stone is over there. So Travis has been doing his PhD looking at coral reefs in Morocco, and I took a picture of his poster on the wall in the main campus. And I also grilled him about what the main things were that were happening in the coral reef. So, if I remember this rightly, so the Pliensbachian-Toarcian boundary is this big extinction of corals. Then you get siliciclastics that suggest that you've got increased runoff, eutrophication, and that's your suggested kill mechanism, right, for the coral reefs at the time. Then there is a recovery of reefs, lower diversity, and you get sponge reefs at the same time. Then those are knocked out by the period of time, the CIE event, or Oceanic Anoxic Event time. So they were hit again. And in your model, that could have been, what do you say here? So you've got an idea of maybe acidification, warming, as well as being the kill mechanism for the coral reefs. And very interestingly, as I understand it, not long after, so still within the CIE in Morocco, you start to see coral reefs coming back again. So very, very interesting record of coral reefs being impacted by, again, different sorts of perturbations during this period of time. And this is another kind of plug as well. So this is Singini's poster. So Singini's doing a PhD on Moroccan stuff, but looking at bivalves and brachiopods, and it'll be very interesting to see how that ties in with the work, the coral work that's being done by Travis and others in the basin. Okay, so it's a complicated story. I think a lot of geochemists want to say, oh, the Oceanic Anoxic Event in the Toarcian, it's all about redox. It's not all about redox. It's much, much more complex than that. As you might expect, if you have a cascading sort of perturbation caused by a large igneous province, basically warming the atmosphere over a considerable period of time, say 500,000 years. So I'm going to end the talk with just a couple of slides about where I see us going next with this sort of research. The first thing is that although there is a lot of data now from Northwest Europe, particularly geochemical data, not so much in the way of actual benthic fossils, there is a huge amount of area for which we have no data at all. So there's really hardly any data in the panthalassic margins. So yeah, up in Canada, stuff that Rowan Martindale's done. The work that was done a few decades ago in the Andean, in the Neuquén Basin by Martin Abraham. Then there are some data over here in Japan, but look at the southern margin of the Tethys Oceans, almost no data at all. And I actually gleaned that there was a paper published a couple of years back that had a whole series of sections that have now been, or published sections, all the way down the eastern margin of East Africa, for example. We don't have any data from there, but there's a rock record to search. So it'd be really good to now kind of globalize both the geochemical and paleontological data from this quite interesting period of time. So that's a challenge for the future. And another challenge as well is integration, not just of geochemical data, but also other paleontological data, which has been gathered for the late Pliensbachian into the Toarcian time period. And that includes a lot of the microfossil work. So there are some quite active microfossil researchers who have published, but we tend not to talk very much with them and integrate with the macrofossil data. So quite a lot of sections who've got foram data. So this is foram and ostracod data from one of the Spanish sections. Ostracods, so these are going to be benthic microfossils. And then, of course, there are the nectonic or planktonic microfossils as well. So things like radiolarians, calcareous nano is really important as well. And also the palindromorphs. So palindromorphs give us all sorts of interesting records. So we've got dinocysts, for example, marine palindromorphs, but then there is also terrestrial palindromorphs as well. So spores, and they're really interesting because they can tell us about what's going on in land during this period of time. Vegetation changes, and we know that there were big vegetation changes, as you might expect, with these sorts of global perturbations in the environment at the time. So it'd be really great to integrate all of this data into, as I put here, a whole ecosystem kind of model for this period of time. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions? Who wants to cube? Cube anyone? Question? Yep. Ooh. Oh, thanks, Crispin, for this nice talk. Do you have any idea why that would be so different? I mean, what is the model then to explain why there would be so different kill mechanisms and they would somehow just work all together at the same time? So, I mean, not work all together, but work at the same time in different places with different kill mechanism. What is the unifying factor here? Or
because volcanic eruption is bigger than Ferrar, right? I mean, you see camp there too. Oh, I'm sorry. You see the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province there too. I mean, and it goes into the Siberian traps. I mean, this is a global volcanic event. And I think the volcanism played.
But camp and Siberian traps are very different ages.
Well, I mean, I don't mean the Siberian, but camp extends into that part of Europe. At least part of it does. Anyway, it's a global volcanic event. It's not just Southern Hemisphere or what used to be Southern Hemisphere. It's global. It's got to be the defining global mechanism. I can't see it any other way. I mean, you've got something that transcends, and you've got supercontinent fragmentation at that time. The Hispanic corridor becomes the North Atlantic. Don't you agree?
Oh, I'm not. I was pretty certain the camp is the wrong age, but I think going back to Stefan's point here is that I may have kind of suggested it like it's only one thing in one basin and another thing in another basin. I don't think that. Because it doesn't make any sense. You can't have, let's say, in the Cleveland Basin, the reduced oxygen is not just some sort of independent phenomenon. It's going to be because of warming at that period of time. It's just that is a more that's the stronger perturbation for the organisms in that basin at that period of time. So they would have been subjected to warming as well but it's just the reduced oxygen is what's doing the damage there. Whereas in the southern Europe, so the Tethyan margins there, decreased oxygen. I'm sure that would have happened because you warm the oceans, you decrease oxygen. It's absolutely inevitable. But there, it seems to be that the temperature increase itself is having more of an effect than any reduction in oxygen.
And interesting fact that you pointed at the bivalve versus the brachiopods, right? And indeed in Morocco, where we use quite often the brachiopods for to date these shallow marine settings very accurately, right? They have the same precision almost as the ammonite zone, right? But I mean, what is the ecological difference between the brachiopods and the belemnites that would then make them reactive? Brachiopods and bivalves, sorry. Yeah.
Well, we know that in modern oceans, brachiopods feed off smaller organic particles than bivalves. But to what extent that is causing the different sorts of responses that we see, I don't know, actually. That is, again, one of the kind of big mysteries that we need to unravel. Why are different groups of organisms responding in different ways? Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it might be that as a group, the brachiopods are more susceptible to rapid temperature increases than the bivalves are. And of course, what's great about those sorts of hypotheses is that people are doing temperature experiments on these groups on modern organisms. So yeah, that would be another interesting thing to investigate looking at modern faunas.
So this is not to throw any of Alex Dunhill's work under the bus or anything, but I'm interested in your opinion. In terms of some of this work, I think we're so eager to start doing sort of, here's the global compilation. This is what's happening globally for the Toarcian. I mean, at what point do you think we can actually do that? All the work that I've done and what you showed here shows that it's so overpowered, shall we say, by the Northern Tethyan stuff. How far do we need to get before we can actually start to look at the global record?
I think we're a long way from it at the moment. So the food web models that we've done, and it is just working its way through the review process at the moment, is only based on the data from the Cleveland Basin. So it's not global. So yeah, I think we're a long way from it at the moment. I think we can probably do it for some basins where we've got a reasonable record. But yeah, there's a lot to do.
How many sites do we need for that global data?
However many you're comfortable with.
Right, more grants, got it.
Yeah. I think we've what we've got at the moment with your Moroccan data, and then with the Spanish data, and then what we know from Northwest Europe, for example, we've got a really beautiful paleolatitudinal control or model that we can build there. So I think that would be an interesting thing to look at next. And one of the things as well that I also forgot to say in the talk is that I am in the Spanish sections, I highlighted a couple of species ranges where the range in the Spanish sections of particular species is longer than in the Cleveland Basin. In other words, we thought that they became extinct at that period of time, but they don't. They actually last longer in further south.
So cool talk. And I want to preface this question by saying I came in a couple minutes late because I was with a student. So hopefully you didn't answer this in the first 3 minutes. But could you talk a little bit more about the mechanisms in the ocean that actually led to this event? Like, I understand that there was big flood basalt volcanism, but did this cause stratification in the oceans? Did it cause an increase in nutrient flux? I mean, this kind of gets back to Stefan's question about what is physically happening to the ecosystem that could explain some of these regional differences.
Well, that's the kind of model that people have posited. So you've got basically a large amount of input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Right.
So general warming, that gives you increased runoff. So basically you get wetter.
Right.
More stormy. So you get more nutrients coming off the land. And in shallow water areas, that can lead to like stratification. So haloclines in the water. And then because you've got more nutrients coming into the shallow water, shallow marine areas, that increases productivity. Increasing productivity leads to reduced oxygen. Also, that is helped with the stratification as well. And then in the open oceans, you could increase the extent of the optimum minimum zones. You can start to acidify to some extent the water column. And again, you'll increase primary productivity. So there's a whole series of things you might expect during a LIP event, which is basically a hyperthermophilic warming of the atmosphere in a relatively short period of time. But of course, in terms of modern context, this could have occurred over 500,000 years, and that's not within decades, which is what we're doing now. So we always have to preface the trying to suggest that these are good proxies for what's happening in the future in relation to time scale. Is the big difference. Yeah,
rates are hugely important. Right. So in this kind of as a follow-up question, I guess, thinking about changes to the ocean with this period of time, if you have a lot of warming, could that have also caused stratification in the open ocean? And do we have any proxies, like do belemnites live at different depths in the water column? You could get some sort of like mixed layer proxy, or
that's really tricky.
Yeah.
Stratification in the open, we don't have much really oceanic sediments at the time. That is one big problem, which is why it's so much nicer when you're working on the Cretaceous, particularly the Oceanic Anoxic Events there, because actually there you have an oceanic record, which we don't have for this part of the Jurassic.
With really clear evidence for stratification, which is what made me think of that. Yeah.
So yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know, but what do you think, Rowan?
I think you're right. It's gonna be hard to also showcase that in deeper waters.
People have used a variety of geochemical proxies for looking particularly at the potential extent of redox zones in the open ocean as a percentage. So molybdenum, for example, has been used. Thallium isotopes.
Yeah, thallium's the one that's like a proxy for manganese burial, I think.
Yeah, so those have been used, but again, it's going back to this. Your one section is that representative of the global ocean, and you always run into problems that way.
Thanks.
Just a comment. I think in Japan they have published some sections now that are in the Pentalasa Ocean that show some anoxia. I mean, some,
so they've got radiolarites there with some black shales right at this horizon. Yeah, but again, it's not in the middle of the ocean. It would be on the edge of the Pantalasic Ocean. Done.